Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience for this rather wonderfully impromptu session, but actually a very special one with Adam Nicolson, in my view, one of Britain's finest writers, who is coming to Jaipur and indeed India, I think, for the first time. So wonderful to be able to welcome him here. And he's come with his most recent book, The Seabirds Cry, which we're going to be talking a bit about in a moment. A book about seabirds, but to say it's just about seabirds is a bit like saying that Hamlet is just about Danish politics, because it's a book that ranges far and wide across the human imagination in the most wonderful way. So I feel that Adam will take us to some of those places, and I'm going to introduce him a little bit more and give you a little bit more background to a very substantial and impressive body of work over the years. I'm not going to talk about all of his books, not least because, of course, I haven't read all of his books, but I have read some that I liked very much indeed. One of his earliest books, Walking Across England, which you did for the National Trust, a very fine illustrated book, which inspired me later to do several books walking across England as well. Other books about England at Perch Hill, talking a little bit about your family background and investigating the countryside. But there's also been a very continuing theme in a lot of your books. Can you hear me? That's better. There's been a very continuing theme in a lot of your books about the Shant Islands, just off the western coast of Scotland, which your father first bought, and I know has been a very central to your life and indeed your literature. You've written about it in a very fine book called Sea Room, a whole series for the BBC, travelling up the west coast of Scotland. And I know that's a very central motivating factor for this new book about seabirds. I just can't finish introducing Adam, though, without mentioning what, for me, is one of his absolutely finest achievements, which is a fabulous book about Homer, The Mighty Dead, which came out a few years ago, and I've been pressing copies into the hands of my family, friends, and partner, because it's one of those wonderful books that absolutely reanimates someone who we might think we already know, and indeed the story of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. A really terrific book, which I can recommend to everybody. I went off and bought new translations of both the Iliad and the Odyssey as a result of reading that book. So it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Adam, and can we give him a very warm welcome to both Jaipur and to India. And perhaps we can begin, Adam, just by talking a little bit about what led you to writing this new book.
Well, thank you very much, Hugh. I always think that's the best bit of any book festival talk, to be welcomed like that. But The Seabirds Cry is really about a subject that most people care absolutely nothing about. But which is of huge importance to me. And there are two things, really. The first is that seabirds of the world are in absolutely catastrophic decline at the moment. It's probably 2/3 of all the seabirds in the world have disappeared over the last 50 years. And their decline is continuing. The graph is heading inexorably downwards. And the second thing is that even while this has been happening, we have come to understand more about them than ever before. That people now, through miniature electronic logging instruments and depth gauges and even miniature heart monitors, now know more about the seabirds' life and mind than they ever have. And so we're in this very, very strange situation that, and I think it is probably emblematic of something much wider across our relationship with nature, that just as we are destroying something, and I think that's not too strong a word, we are coming to understand it. There's a famous line of Hegel's, who said that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. That's the bird of wisdom who sits on Athene's hand in Greek mythology, only flies when the thing that you're trying to understand is itself disappearing. We're just grasping at the few disappearing threads of this extraordinary phenomenon. There are probably now 500 million seabirds in the world. There were 1.5 billion 50 years ago, and there may be very, very few left by the end of this century. And so that's what this book is about. It's a plea, really, and a call to arms to save these things.
And I think what's very attractive about the book as well is why birds matter, so to speak, in terms of the human imagination.
Birds do matter. The birds are in all cultures, are the great carriers of that sense of otherness. They come from a place we don't know, they arrive temporarily in our lives, and above all, they fly. They're not subject to gravity like the rest of us. And so the seabird has always been emblematic of a kind of fuller, stranger, more distant dimension of our minds and lives.
There's a lovely quote in the book from Simone Weil, I think, about gravity.
Yes, Simone Weil, the great sort of French mystic, wrote during the war in her last essay. She wrote, "Obedience to gravity, the greatest sin." And it's a sin that birds and seabirds never commit. And they are emblem of that ability to move beyond the mundane and the deadly, really. They are emblems of the ability to live. And
have you come to this book as a naturalist who wants, an adopted naturalist who wants to write a book about seabirds, or as a writer who then met naturalists who led him to the seabirds? What's the provenance?
Well, I really fell in love with seabirds in the Chantiles, the islands you described. And maybe shall I show some pictures of that to explain the sources of my fascination with these things? If we could have the screen. So here's a picture of what most people think of seabirds. All they are horrible flying rats that steal your fish and chips from your hand as you sit on the seaside. But seabirds are much, much more than that. They are glamorous, dangerous, exotic things. This is a northern Atlantic seabird called the shag. And that is the shag's eye. And these birds have been in existence for the last 65 million years. That eye was looking at you like that when the dinosaurs were walking the earth. And I don't think it takes much imagination to see that. It's also a world of extraordinary cruelty, that there are cannibal gulls like this herring gull. This is a terrifying sea eagle on the west coast of Scotland, just grabbing a fulmar in mid-flight. There's a sort of scale and nobility and drama of existence here. That's me being attacked by a great skua last summer in Scotland. Very exciting. If ever you get to Scotland, I can recommend being attacked by a great skua. And these are the islands that Hugh was talking about, the Chantiles in the Hebrides. And this is, it's a tiny, remote, rocky, dangerous, steep place. And a place that really couldn't be further from Jaipur in atmosphere and feeling, with these huge cliffs and great big rock slopes. And in those slopes on the left there, every summer, 300,000 seabirds come to breed. It's an absolutely teeming city of birds, surrounded by this rather rough sea which stirs up the water and feeds the birds with nutrients or feeds the fish they prey on. It's a wild, wild place. And this was somewhere that my father bought for £1,200 in 1937, and which we've been going to ever since. And you can see high drama landscape. And this is the kind of place the seabird loves. let's see if we can go on now. And so this is a little film here of, that's me on the left and my father on the right there, when I was about 10 years old. And my father took me there when I was a boy, and he's pointing out all the beautiful views around. You can see these very, very steep islands in the background. We're meant to be heading straight on from where we are, but I am failing to row adequately, and so we gradually drift round and round. But he took me there when I was a boy and introduced me to this extreme scale of existence that I'd never encountered before. I'm getting a bit knackered at this stage, but we can move on. Now, here is a film that I made a few years ago for the BBC, or a little clip from one. One evening, I don't know if you can see that there on the screen, but the entire screen, I know, I'm afraid the resolution is not right, the sun's shining on it. Can you see? This absolutely extraordinary flood of animal life that comes into these islands every spring. 300,000 birds that have spent the winter out in the Atlantic come back to this island, and there's me talking on the thing. And then, of course, seabirds live, a lot of them, under the sea. But this is the site there. And the point about this picture is that it's a vision of what life could be like, or the natural world could be like, if we hadn't interfered with it. Very, very few places have a density of natural life like this one. And that is an absolutely standard picture on a standard summer morning in these islands. Absolutely stuffed with birds, like a bazaar in Jaipur. A kind of richness of animal life you don't get elsewhere. And most of those are the puffin. I don't know how many of you know about a puffin. Anyone met a puffin here? We've got 3 people who know about puffins. Puffins are some of the great birds of the North Atlantic. Very elegant, beautiful, orange-faced things, which cluster in little groups on the island like this. And let's see if this works. This is meant to be a little film of them. Yes. And so you can see that people love these birds because they look like Edwardian gentlemen just gathering for a whiskey and soda in the club. Some of them just asking the others to pass the port. Maybe, have you got a cigar on you? There's a sort of lovely sort of formality about the way in which these creatures deal with each other. Was that the best bit so far? Yes. Sometimes it's not quite as good. This one got stuck down a very muddy burrow last summer and got a bit messy in the process. But when they've gone for a dip in the ocean, they emerge in this beautiful, absolutely elegant. If someone turned up to a party looking like that, you wouldn't turn them away, would you? And one very intriguing thing about the puffin is that they all look newly made. And the reason they look newly made is that that every feather and every bit of orange in bill and foot stuff is a new thing for that season. It's renewed every spring. And the orangeness is what matters about them. Because you see how very, very orange that is. Well, here is a man whose job it is in Iceland to catch puffins. And the reason that he's dressed in orange is that puffins just love orange. And if they see an orange man, they will fly towards him and he'll have the puffin for his dinner. Now, sometimes the color system goes wrong. These are very weird, strange puffins. But the perfect puffin, when it's in fine breeding fettle, looks like that. Now, at the end of the year, the puffin ends up looking like that when all its breeding is over. And the reason is that when a puffin looks like that, it is designed to attract a mate. But by the time the end of the summer comes, it doesn't need a mate any longer, and it ends up looking like that. And so the one on the left is puffin dressed for sex, and the one on the right is the puffin that never needs to have sex again. And I don't know about you, but I know which one I would rather shack up with. Now, I think we can skip that. We could have another bit of conversation if you like now, or I could tell another bird story. What would you like to do, Hugh?
Tell another bird story. They're
okay.
all good.
Right, this is one of the great North Atlantic birds called the fulmar, in fact, in the Pacific as well. Incredible flyers. And you can see that wing is just designed for flying. They're not very good walking around on the earth, but they are one of the most exquisite aerial acrobats that of any bird on earth. And the very extraordinary thing that's just discovered about these birds is what they do. Oh no, I want to show a film there. Can we show a film on that one? Not that one. This one. Can we make that? No. No. Is it going to work? No, it won't work. So we're going to move on to another bird. This is called the shearwater. And the shearwater is another one of the great ocean travelers. That they live in large numbers on the west coast of Europe. And no one knew anything about them until the 1930s, when a man in Wales, on the western edge of Britain, decided he wanted to investigate how a shearwater flew across the world. And he sent 2 of them by plane to Venice, which is the other side of Europe, on the Adriatic Sea, on part of the Mediterranean Sea. And they were released in Venice, and 12 days later, from Venice, probably something like 1,500 miles away, they arrived back in their burrows in West Wales. And that is his photograph of the shearwater that flew from Venice. No one could understand how he'd done it, how on earth had they navigated across the entire continent from a place they'd never been before. But then more recently, people have been tracking these shearwaters across the Atlantic Ocean. And that is a track of a single shearwater over 2 years, starting in the Azores, going down to South America, across to South Africa, back up to Canada, Newfoundland, and then back to the European coast. So 2 years of journeying from a very, very young bird. And absolutely clearly, when doing that, it was researching what the ocean could offer. Because if you can see that, in the following years, that shearwater that had done that research trip across the Atlantic then spent different years in different parts of the ocean. It was deciding sometimes to go to the South Atlantic, sometimes to spend time off the coast of South Africa, sometimes off the coast of South America. And so this extraordinary ability of a seabird to decide where to go in the giant spaces of the ocean is something that no one until a couple of years ago has suspected. I mean, those journeys are 25, 30, 40,000 miles long. And how on earth is it doing it? That is the question. How on earth is it knowing where to go fishing? How can it decide what to do? And last year, a scientist decided to experiment with some shearwaters in the Azores. And she took 3 lots of these shearwaters, and some she did nothing to, some she blocked their noses so they couldn't smell, and some she put magnets on their heads so they wouldn't have any magnetic understanding of the Earth's magnetic field. And then she took them 500 miles away and released them. And so here at the left-hand end is where the shearwater's home was, here. And over on that side there is where she released them. And this lot here, they were all released over there. Pretty well, they flew straight home. This is so they somehow got straight home. This lot here are the ones that had magnets attached to their heads, and they also pretty well went straight home. Those three on the right there are the maps of the journeys made by the shearwaters that had had their sense of smell temporarily blocked. And those shearwaters, released over on the right-hand side, trying to get over to the left-hand side, just became totally lost, wandering for week after week around the ocean, trying to find out the way back home. The implication being, of course, that the way in which shearwaters can navigate around the ocean is by smell. They can actually smell their way around the world. And the world ocean is a total sort of odor landscape that they can detect where they are and where to go within it. And the disaster that is happening, or one aspect of the disaster, is this. This is in the Caribbean a couple of weeks ago, and that you can see floating on the sea there is plastic rubbish. That is part of the 8 million tons of plastic rubbish that we dump in the ocean every year. And that's significant because plastic, when it floats for a while in the sea, starts to smell like food. It gives off the same chemical plumes that fish do for the seabirds. And so seabirds eat vast amounts of plastic. This is an albatross from Hawaii with its entire gut filled with plastic rubbish. You can see a cigarette lighter in the middle there, simply because that bird thought it was eating food. And so this is one of the most damaging things that's going on at the moment, responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of seabirds every year. I think we could have a pause. Do you want more chat?
Well, I think one question the audience needs answering is the poor shearwaters whose sense of smell was blocked, did they ever get back, so to speak? I mean, was it temporarily blocked?
The ones that had their sense of smell blocked got back, most of them the following year, but not all of them got back. And one of the dimensions of this that is quite disturbing is that science is a very cruel business. You know, science does terrible damage to the things it investigates. There's no doubt about that.
So in a way, do you feel yourself a custodian in the sense that you have the birds on the islands which you still own?
Yes, I do. I mean, I feel urgent that we should begin to attend to these animals. It's very, very easy to treat animals as if they don't matter, and if they're usable or disposable. And I think that this story, this double story of extraordinary capacity, none of us would be able to navigate 20, 30, 40,000 miles across the ocean, combined with the completely casual, unthinking damage we're doing, is something I feel passionate about. And I think that we should change our attitudes. That's, you know, the deep attitude is that we are somehow the only intelligent beings. And it is so clearly true that these creatures have an intelligence which may not be very much like us. You know, very few of them could hold literary festivals, but they can do things we can't do. And I think that shift in attitude is very important, yeah.
And do you think that sort of anthropocentrism is increasing, or are we becoming more arrogant about the way we regard ourselves as Lord of the natural universe?
I think there is a completely casual attitude to the destruction of the world. That I made a film a few years ago about the whaling industry in the South Atlantic. And the year in which most whales were killed was the last year in which any whales were killed. In other words, we drove straight up to the cliff and fell off it. That we are very, very bad, for some reason or other, about pre-regulating our behavior before catastrophe strikes. And seabirds is one of them, one of the dimensions in which that becomes apparent, and global warming is another, you know, that until it really imposes on us, we're not going to mind.
Now, the book is subtitled The Lives and Loves of puffins and the other birds. So you mentioned a little bit there about puffins and the way they could attract the opposite sex. So it seems in order to have a little bit of a discussion about their love lives as well, about which I know very little myself. So are they generally monogamous? Are they the sort of bird that pair for life? Are they very polygamous?
Yes. Well, let me just, if we could have the pictures back on the screen. So let me just talk about the albatrosses. These are these wonderful southern hemisphere, as you can see, vast, wonderful ocean cruisers, which fly. This is a wandering albatross off Tasmania. Some of them fly 5 million miles in their lifetime. Some of them fly 5 years round and round that southern ocean without ever touching land. And they live for an extraordinarily long time. These albatrosses, the oldest ever counted was 85 years old. And they, as you say, Hugh, remain incredibly loyal to their mate. The longest recorded albatross marriage is 50 years long, which, anyone would be quite pleased with that, wouldn't they? But and you can see they are just the master ocean flyers. That wing, from one wingtip to the other, is 11 feet. That is a huge animal. Be this high if it was standing here. Now, I've got a graph here, which you slightly have to concentrate on. Somebody measured the relative size of a bird's brain against their life habits, especially to do with sex. And if you were a serial monogamist on the left here, so you had one wife or husband after another, your brain was just less than average size. If you stayed with your husband or wife for more than a year, it was a bit bigger than average. If you were very long term or actually lived in a cooperative system with other birds, your brain was huge. And those are the albatrosses. They have really enormous brains. Very long marriage requires enormous mental capacity. If you're totally promiscuous, you crash back down to the average. And if you're polygamous, if you've got lots of wives, very, 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 very stupid. But the stupidest of all are the females who've got lots of husbands. They have no brain to speak of. So, the answer, the kind of the thing that graph will tell you is that if you want to be clever and you want to be happy, be an albatross and stick with the wife.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, in the book, I mean, there is a lot, of course, about birds, but there's a lot about the other half of the title. There's a lot about the sea and your attraction for the sea. You describe the sea in many ways, the wine-dark sea that you talked about in your book on Homer. And you know that stretch of water very well, having sailed across it and sailed up it. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that element of the book as well.
Yes, well, I mean, maybe for all of us, I don't know, but certainly for us in Britain, the sea does remain the one great wilderness remaining. It is the place where human beings have not managed to shape how things are, or at least as much as they have on Earth. And so I think it has that very, very deep attraction that here is a wildness, here's a place with extraordinarily interesting forms of life and interactions of life. And I think that well, perhaps for many cultures, I don't know, but certainly for me, it's a place of liberation. That out at sea, you can feel released into the nature of the world as it is. You know, that what you are surrounded by has not been trammeled or pre-digested, that wildness is stimulus like that. But of course, the states of the sea is catastrophic, so I could do some more of my thing. If we just go on now, we have some more of the pictures up here. This is a picture that illustrates global warming, that of course polar bears, when the Arctic seas were icy, were able to go out onto the ice to hunt, but now there is no ice or much reduced ice. They are attacking guillemot colonies. That's what these seabirds are here, and that has always seemed to me, it's a picture a couple of years old, an image of the threat that is hanging over the seabird world. And this is a graph of what has happened to world seabirds over the last 60 years. So 60 years ago, there were 300 million seabirds counted. It's now down to about 100 million. This isn't all the seabirds in the world, this is just the number that were counted. And as you can see, that graph shows very little sign of heading anywhere except down. And so this is a picture, this is a film. Oh no, that's not working. Sorry.
Quite interesting.
No, we'll go past there. If this can stand in for the number of seabirds there were in 1950, then that is the number of seabirds there are now, and that is the number of seabirds there will be by the end of the century. And if I have one point to make, it is those three slides. That there is a picture of truly radical destruction of a very beautiful, incredibly capable, diverse, rich form of life, which we are destroying without any of us knowing about it. None of us are aware, really, of this going on. I mean, I wasn't until a few years ago. And the reason that that is the future, that emptiness is the future, is the warming of the seas, the overfishing, the catching of very, very large number of seabirds in trawls, fishing trawls, and in long lines in the Southern Ocean. The destruction of breeding sites all over the world by dogs, rats, cats, development, the building of new places on them. And so we are within a totally sleepwalker, blind way, walking towards a situation in which that is the picture of seabird life on Earth. And it's a tragedy which I think it would be very marvelous to avoid. Let me just finish with this. On the islands that Hugh was talking about, the Shant Islands in the Hebrides, we had rats, and rats were destroying many seabirds every year. And last winter, we set out poison across all the islands. 2,500 stations with rat poison in every 25 yards across the island. An enormous project funded by the European Union, and with the idea that at least in a tiny place like that, and other islands also have had it done, about 400 islands across the world, if in a small place like that you can just lift one burden off these creatures, that can only be a very good thing. And sure enough, this summer, for the first time, these little wrens came to nest in the island in a way they never had before. The first, thank you. I feel like that's marvelous to be in Jaipur, to have the wrens on the shants applauded. That is really, that's been worth living for. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I can end there.
And can I just ask, before we open the floor to questions, can I just ask Adam, is there something about the sort of panda principle that, you know, seabirds aren't quite as soft and cuddly as koalas, so to speak, that when we make these ecological campaigns, we often tend to focus on the soft and cuddly? Is that part of the problem, do you think, in the attitude to seabirds?
I think the real problem is that they are actually invisible, that they live most of their life out at sea. They breed in very remote places that are difficult to get to, and most people don't know that they're there even. I mean, I know that in the British Isles, something like 8 million seabirds breed around the coasts, and I think probably 0.1% of them are ever seen by human beings. And so I think it's the sheer invisibility of it that is the heart of the problem. If we were thinking, although, you know, people have trashed their land birds as much. I was in Sydney last year, and all the beautiful land birds of the country around Sydney only survive in Sydney Zoo. It's a sad, sad state to get to.
Oh dear, oh dear. Well, in a moment we're going to take some questions. I do notice that some members of the audience have very cleverly chosen to wear orange, obviously hoping to attract a few puffins, the ones that are circling over Jaipur, waiting to pounce with amorous intent. And of course, anyone wearing orange will be given preference when asking a question. But it is time for questions. So we do have some roving mics, and if anyone could put up their hand who would like to ask a question. There's a lady wearing a turquoise scarf 3 rows from the back. Sorry, the front, I beg your pardon, 3 rows from the front.
Hi. So,
if you could hold the mic quite high, thank you.
Is this better now? Okay, so one of the major problems we see with seabirds is that as migratory species, you require, for their conservation, you require international cooperation on a grand scale. We have international legislation that is pretty good. We have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, we have the Migratory Species Treaties. But do you really think, do you really think that it's going to work? And secondly, you were talking about the poisoning of rats, but if you poison the rats, it's going to affect other birds, especially owls and other raptors that depend on them. So what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yes, so just to broadly summarize, can international legislation help in terms of preserving seabirds? And the supplementary question, is there a problem with putting out poison for rats in that you might also poison other birds as well?
Yeah, so just to address the poison question, we were very, very careful about choosing the kind of poison that we used, and also did it at a time when there were very few birds around at all. In fact, most of these birds are summer migrants. They're out at sea during the winter. We did it all during the winter, and we put it in things which no other animals could get into except rats, or mice would have been able to, but we checked there were no mice there before we did it, which no mice, and so it strictly targeted the rats, and I think it was fine. On the question of international legislation, yes, it's absolutely key, and there are many things that one could do and are being done. For example, in controlling the way in which people fish, and making sure that birds aren't caught on the hooks of the long lines as they go in, and so on. And also establishing marine protected areas, which is a big movement going on at the moment. Very, very large areas of the world ocean are being designated as catch-free. And there's a marvelous new experiment being done by a French seabird scientist called Henri Weimerskirch in the Southern Ocean, which is if all fishing boats are required to carry pingers now, which advertise their location to satellites, and so the supervisory agencies can see where they are. But they often turn them off, so nobody knows where they are. But Henri Weimerskirch has been fitting albatrosses with radar detecting equipment. And so the albatrosses themselves can find the fishing boats that are intending to do damage to them. And the albatrosses then report to the central agencies in France, or there's one in the UK, it's probably here, I don't know, about the illegal fishing. And so yes, I think all of these international legislation, marine protected areas, control of fishing techniques is definitely the way to go.
What a wonderful image, the idea of albatrosses circling the world in the southern oceans with radar monitoring illegal fishing boats. That's a lovely idea. More questions, please. Any hands? There's a lady in the pink, again 3 rows from the front.
My question is, you know, human beings are becoming so selfish. You know, we have destroyed the planet as much as we can, or we might still be able to destroy it furthermore. All these efforts, you know, do you think we can backtrack our steps and make the environment not as much as good as it was, but you know, can we do that? Will we be able to protect the environment and protect the human beings as well?
Yes, I do. I feel genuinely optimistic about that. That I see no reason why, if we get our act together, we couldn't change things. I mean, one of the big problems is that global warming changes the whole current system of the oceans. And so where the fish are, where the prey fish are, move, and they're often too far away. And so the parent birds have to go much too far to feed their chicks at the breeding time. And that's been a catastrophic thing in Northern Europe, that millions and millions of birds have disappeared for that reason. And so this is a very deep change in the regime of the oceans. And I'm sure it is not going to be a switch that is flicked back overnight. But if most of the damage has been done in the last 50 years, we might have now 50 years to repair it. And no, I do feel optimistic about that. And for example, not to use plastic bags. No plastic bags in your entire life will save 10 seabirds. We can do that. So, yes.
And another question. There's at the back, the lady in the black.
Thank you for this, because very often I feel like human beings have a sense of entitlement, and we're so kind of unaware of the dwindling numbers of so many species. I was wondering if captive breeding plays a part in kind of increasing the numbers of some of these seabirds, because by the time we address the problems of climate change and the amount of plastic we have to deal with, I was wondering if captive breeding can address some of these problems of dwindling numbers.
Yes, so do you think that captive breeding can increase numbers of seabirds as well? Is that part of the solution?
Well, I don't know if you've ever come close to a gannet or a puffin, but they are genuinely wild creatures. And various attempts to breed them in captivity have not gone particularly well. They're extremely difficult to keep in captivity. That's not true of all of them. There are some, the cormorants. You know that people in China use cormorants as fishermen use cormorants. And I don't know if in India people use cormorants for fishing, do they? Does anyone know about that? No. So I think that the numbers are so huge and the problem is so enormous that the scale required to turn things around, as this lady says down here, could scarcely be addressed by a few captive creatures being bred. I mean, there are, if you take those shearwaters, I think there are something like 10 million shearwaters in the world. And if they're on that kind of decline, there are going to be 3 million less in 10 years' time. You're not going to address that with captive breeding. So it's got to be much more systematic than that, about recognition that they matter, a respect for their being, really. I think that it's about changing a whole assumption about what animals are, and then very powerful, as the lady said here, powerful international legislation. It's got to be at a big supra-governmental level. Oh.
Oh dear, just assisting someone who unfortunately has been taken ill. So let us have another question, please. It's a question, a gentleman waving his hand at the back there in the black, close to the column. Oh, or do we already have a gentleman? Yeah, there's a gentleman standing up. Perhaps we should take it in order and then come back to the other gentleman, if that's all right.
Hi, I would just like to know what would be the adverse environmental effect on humans if there are no seabirds? Thank you.
Yes, the environmental effect on humans if there are no seabirds. In other words, does it matter in any kind of material way? Yes, it undoubtedly will. I mean, one of the things that's just been discovered last year is that, I don't know how to put this discreetly, but because seabirds go to the toilet on the sea, they actually redistribute nutrients in the sea, that they fertilize their own world. And it's been shown that if there are no seabirds, and this is actually true of whales as well, that if there are no seabirds, then the entire nutrient cycling system of the ocean shuts down. They're one of the key vectors that draws nutrients from the fish community and redistributes it around the ocean so that the ocean remains fertile. And all of those nutrients then feed the planktonic life and the small fish life and the bigger fish life, and so the whole cycle goes round. If you cut that system, if you actually, if you sever the connection at the seabird level, the whole thing stops, or is anyway deeply diminished. And so there are many dimensions to this, and one of them is that one of the great carbon sinks, one of the places which mops up atmospheric carbon more than any other, is the ocean. And if you don't have that vegetable plankton life, that phytoplankton life going on in the ocean, you won't mop up so much carbon. The carbon will remain in the atmosphere, and the global warming problem will accelerate out of control. And so, I mean, I never argue this case, because the case that I want to make is that these are extraordinarily beautiful and valuable things and forms of life to be treasured in themselves. But if we're thinking about us, then if you don't have a living ocean, you have no fish. You have a kind of dank and dead planet.
Thank you. Thank you. And there's a gentleman there waiting to ask another question.
Do you feel, sir, that they will outlive man?
I'm so sorry. There's quite a lot of background noise, so could you repeat the question a bit louder? It's difficult to hear on the stage.
Do you feel that these seabirds will outlive man?
It's a very good question. Well, one fascinating thing about seabirds is that many of their lineages, many of their evolutionary lines actually survived the great catastrophe 66 million years ago, when the dinosaurs and most of life on Earth went extinct. The penguins, the geese and ducks, the cormorants, all existed before the death of the dinosaurs. That picture I showed you of that green-eyed shag, that is a picture from before that catastrophe. And so this is a consolation in a way, that if we end up, if Mr. Trump ends up destroying the world, the seabirds will survive. And in that way, I think, do embody a kind of life wisdom that is greater than ours. They have not built cities or governments or armies or states, but they have formed, they are a form of life that is totally wrapped around the whole planet. And I hold, I think there's great consolation in that they will outlast us. Yes, thank you for that. Thank you.
What a wonderful range of questions. Well, unfortunately, we're coming now to the end of this session, but that's been a fascinating tour of seabirds. Wonderful pictures as well. And can we all give a very warm round of applause for Adam and his great support for the birds.
Thank you to Adam Nicolson and also to Hugh Thomson for moderating that session.